Well, thank you to everyone who's joined us and to our amazing speakers today for joining us for our program on trade doublespeak. Could digital trade non-discrimination rules undermine competition policy and other forms of digital governance? I'm Lori Wallach, and I am the director of Rethink Trade, and I am sitting here in Washington, D.C. during this lunch hour in the East Coast of the US and cocktail hour in Geneva. Thank you for all the intrepid folks who are with us. And we're going to explore an aspect of the digital trade topic that has gotten less attention, and certainly than issues like data flows or digital service taxes or cross-border charges on digital products. However, it is an issue that could have enormous impact. And the backstory of it is that many of the US mega platforms started trying to take a page out of the playbook of Big Pharma, where they thought they could insert into trade agreements rules that could limit domestic policy space, force the hands of different governments in the way that at the formation of the WTO itself, Big Pharma was able to extend patent monopolies in a free trade agreement. This idea was to actually commandeer different negotiations, including those in the WTO on e-commerce, to try and establish a set of binding rules. And one of those rules basically has now started to emerge as a very dangerous one that big tech has proposed. These issues weren't in the fore in the US because we weren't trying to regulate tech platforms, so the conflicts weren't as apparent. However, actually, the warning about this conflict in part came from the issue of the so-called non-discrimination rules for digital products and trade agreements, and how actually the big tech platforms and their lobby shops were publicly claiming that other countries' policies violated this concept, these rules. This became an alert. In the US, there is a report that every year, the National Trade Estimates report allows industry to try and report what they think are illegal trade barriers around the world. And these policies in other countries, like Korea's App Store bill, like the Australian and Canadian policies to make the big platforms pay for the content, the news content that they use. These platforms start to get attacked as illegal trade barriers. All of this is valuable in alerting competition policy and anti-monopoly activists in the US that some kind of a Trojan horse maneuver probably was on the way. So there is no US agreement that actually has these rules in it that went through Congress, except for the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. And so far, Canada has dodged the bullet as far as attacks on its domestic policies because it did a carve out for cultural industries. So the particular policy that the US corporations have tried to attack has been safe. But the US big mega platforms want to use WTO negotiations, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and other negotiations the US is in to try and push out what we're going to learn is really a twisted notion of the longstanding trade concept of national treatment as a means to undermine countries around the world simultaneously from implementing policies that target based on the size of an entity or if it is dominant, for instance, for competition policy and antitrust, or that may have a disparate impact based on a company being bigger, even though it may be a law of general application for health or for labor. And this particular provision we are going to spotlight today because it's very dangerous and it needs to have more attention. At the moment, just to get us up to date, the US withdrew its proposal for this kind of a non-discrimination for digital products provision to be in the WTO's joint statement initiative because no other country in the world wanted to join the US. After it submitted it in 2019, the US was out there alone. So it withdrew that. And in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework negotiations, the US suspended negotiations on this provision after having initially early on tabled a provision that was identical to that in the USMCA. It is a provision that is rarely in agreements, that should not be in agreements. And to explain more of why that is, I am going to introduce an amazing panel. And before I say that, for folks who have questions about what the heck is going on in the US in digital trade, we'll have question and answers at the end. So please start thinking about what issues you want to raise. But just to kick off our panel, I want to first introduce my colleague, Daniel Rangel. He's the research director at Rethink Trade, where I'm the director. Daniel worked as an attorney in Colombia in international trade and competition policy matters after he got a law and a political science degree from the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota. He also has a master's degree in international economic policy from Sciences Po and an LLM from the Georgetown University Law Center, where he graduated top of his class. He has a decade of experience working on trade law and policy. He's authored major reports on digital trade. He's litigated several of the US, Mexico, Canada Agreement labor rights cases. He also has written a lot about the distributional impacts of trade. And he is going to present a paper that lays out the history of and the potential impacts of the non-discrimination of digital products provision. We will then hear from two amazing commentators. One of those people is Amanda Lewis. She is a partner at the Washington, D.C.-based law firm Cuneo Gilbert DeLuca. She's a co-founder of the Responsible Online Commerce Coalition. That's a coalition of Amazon sellers, small businesses who are having to deal with all the predations of Amazon as competing with the smaller business. She fights for open and fair markets online. She's an expert in competition policy. She spent a decade at the Federal Trade Commission, which in the United States is the agency that in part has responsibility for competition policies. She was a counsel detailee, which means she was borrowed out to the US House of Representatives as a policy expert. And there she worked on the very famous bipartisan investigation of competition in digital markets, which resulted in a book-sized report published 2 years ago at the Energy and Commerce Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives.
Actually, the Judiciary Committee.
Sorry, Judiciary Committee.
As you know, there's a fierce rivalry there, so.
Judiciary Committee, pardon me. And Burju Killick is a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Her research and her writing and her scholarship focuses digital rights, intellectual property, innovation, and trade. She's provided technical advice for governments around the world. She headed the Frontier Technology Policy docket at the Minderoo Foundation and was a practitioner fellow at the Digital Civil Society Lab at Stanford University. Before that, for a decade, she directed the Digital Rights Program at Public Citizen, the national US consumer group, and she also led the research at Public Citizen on access to medicines issues. She completed her PhD at Queen Mary University of London, and she holds an LLM degree in intellectual property law from Queen Mary University, and also an information technology law degree, master's from Stockholm University. She obtained her law degree from the Ankara University in Turkey. So stellar crew. And we're going to start with Daniel presenting the paper. Daniel, please.
Thank you, Lori. So our research on the non-discrimination rules is based on actually understanding the potential for the non-discrimination rules for digital products to undermine competition policy and other forms of digital governance. And this is so because, as some of you have seen during the UNCTAD e-week, most of the debates about digital trade revolve around data and duties on electronic transmissions. We also know it as the moratorium. But as a matter of fact, the digital trade and e-commerce agreements, or FTA chapters, include so many provisions that go beyond cross-border data flows, location of computing facilities, and norms are similar to the moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions. And the one that we are focusing on right now is often labeled non-discriminatory treatment for digital products. This rule often includes both national treatment and most favored nation. And if anyone in our audience is not familiar with those terms, I'm going to quickly explain them in a moment. Digital products are normally defined in these rules as computer programs, text, video, images, sound recorders, and other products that are digitally encoded. So it's a very broad and open-ended definition that potentially covers platforms, apps, and digital services. And the first agreement that had this rule was the US-Singapore FTA that was signed in 2004. And since then, more than 30 international agreements include these non-discrimination rules. It has to be said that we have now over 200 deals that have rules on e-commerce or on digital trade, and it's only about 30 that have this kind of rule. So it's not many of them. And most of them include the US, Singapore, and to a lesser extent, Australia or Chile. The non-discrimination principle is not unknown for trade lawyers. The first experience of the first version of it appeared in the most favored nation clauses that have been included in trade agreements since the early 18th century, and they were included in the friendship, commerce, and navigation treaties. And then in the 20th century, US trade agreements started having national treatment obligations. And basically the idea here is that most favored nation was a way to prevent the erosion of the concessions that each country give each other through trade negotiations. So if you're granting something to country A, you cannot erode it by granting more favorable treatment to country C. That's kind of the idea. And similarly, national treatment was intended to ensure that the tariff reductions that countries were negotiating among themselves were not eroded through internal taxation or fees. This started to change with the negotiation of the GATT, because in 1947, there was a typo there, some of the most important countries in the world negotiated the GATT, and it included Article 3, which covers both fiscal and non-fiscal measures. That is, every law, regulation, requirement that affects the internal sale, offering for sale, purchase, transportation, distribution, or use of goods. So it has a very wide net. But in order to make sure that the GATT didn't go into actually telling countries how to regulate, the negotiators' ultimate objective was to outlaw protectionist intent. And that got included in Article 3.1 of the GATT. The issue is that when you get into a challenge against a domestic measure, some of the measures that have been challenged are actually not discriminating on the basis, on the origin of the goods, or what we call in trade law, de jure claims. There's also the possibility for a discrimination that happens when the two set of goods are different, and that means that the same policy can have disparate impact between those two set of goods. And the question in these cases is, how do we identify simply regulatory differences and disparate impact, and where there is really a protectionist intent? The problem with this is that throughout the years, the WTO adjudicating bodies have, in a way, consolidated a very one-sided way of interpreting this standard. And basically, the first case that analyzed the issue of intent in the content of Article 3 of the GATT was Japan Alcoholic Beverages, in which the appellate body clearly said that intent is not something that should be analyzed in the context of a WTO dispute over discrimination. And then the appellate body report the next year said that it will accept evidence about discrimination, but about intent, but only when it was evidence about protectionist intent. And that was said very clearly almost a decade later in Mexico soft drinks, where the rule was elucidated. And basically it means that the declared intention of legislators and regulators of the member adopting a measure should not be totally disregarded, particularly when the explicit objective of the measure is that of affording protection to domestic production. So basically, at the WTO, if you can find evidence of protectionist intent, then that's going to be used to strike down a measure. But if there's not such evidence, then and there's evidence about intent of other type of public policy objectives, then that's not going to be enough to save the measure. Considering this case law, it's very important to analyze how these rules are actually negotiated and how they are drafted. Since the US has been the main proponent of this obligation along with Singapore, it is important to analyze the evolution of the US model of the rule. And basically, since the US-Singapore deal and up until the Trans-Pacific Partnership, US negotiators had historically developed a very well-established structure for digital non-discrimination obligations. And arguably so, that was because of the jurisprudence that has been developed at the WTO. And basically, it included a system that had both discrimination for the digital product's origin and the origin of the digital product provider. It incorporated both national treatment and most favored nation obligations, and it explicitly referenced protectionist intent for national treatment de facto claims. And this is very important in our view, because as you can see in the next slide, after TPP, and it got consolidated in the USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the US flattened out the standard. And when you go into the Singapore-US deal, you have a first agreement, a first clause that basically covers national treatment de jure claims, and that's so because it says that it prohibits discrimination on the basis of the origin of the product or the supplier of the product, and that's so both in the Singapore-US FTA, but also in the Korea-US FTA. But when you go into the facto claims, it has this so as otherwise to afford protection language, and that's the language that is used in the GATT to make sure that the measures that are covered and that they are deemed discriminatory under that standard are actually protectionist because they have protectionist intent. We don't see that kind of language on the USMCA version of the rule. And that's very problematic because that will mean that basically any kind of policy that has the effect of having a more favorable impact on domestic producers or less favorable treatment on certain kind of foreign producers, then that could be considered discriminatory and a trade barrier under these rules. So how could this affect competition policy and other forms of digital governance? Well, the obvious answer is that most digital competition policies that are being implemented right now, they are size-based because they depend on market power, and they're trying to target the firms that actually have wielded that power and have engaged in anti-competitive conduct. And those firms are often headquartered in the US. And here's a list of some of these laws that have this kind of application. South Korea's Upsource Law, Australia's News Media Bargaining Code, and a similar policy in Canada, the EU's Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act, a Germany law that is basically a revamp of the competition policy over there, and Japan's Transparency Act. At Rethink Trade last year, we published a report in which we analyzed the national trade estimate submissions that industry made for 2 years, and we identified already how the discrimination argument has been used against these policies. Just to give you an example, last year, in October of 2020, the Information Technology and Industry Council challenged Australian News Media Bargaining Code and said, in solely targeting US companies, the code conflicts with basic principles of national treatment and non-discrimination under the Australia-US FTA and under the WTO GATS agreement. So that's a problem with this provision, and that's one of the reasons why the ambassador Catherine Tide decided to withdraw this provision from the JSI context. Recently, Ambassador Tide stated, measures that may look like they have a discriminatory effect may or may not be advanced with discriminatory intent. So we can read into that USTR is currently assessing its position on these non-discrimination rules so that it can actually capture those measures that have protectionist intent and not competition policies that are trying to level the playing field. The issue is that the US is also engaged in other talks in which this provision could come up, such as the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the US-Kenya Strategic Trade Investment Partnership, the STIP, and the US-Taiwan trade conversations. And that's the end of my presentation.
And we are going to follow up that presentation, which is information I think a lot of people are not as aware about, but it's very important to dig into given the broad implications. And to make the implications clearer, we're now going to have a conversation with Amanda and with Burju. So I'm going to start, Amanda, with you. And let me ask you, with your clients, with both the companies who are worried about the big tech platforms, who are, some of them are not tiny companies, but still crushing them. In addition, with the coalition you work with, the Amazon sellers, tell us why smaller anyway, but profitable tech firms really are so supportive of these competition policies and have become concerned about the notion of maybe having the domestic policies they want internationally preempted by these trade agreements. Help us understand their thinking.
So thanks, Lori. And yeah, I advise a lot of tech companies, many of which are based in the US, of all different sizes, from smaller businesses to household brand names that everyone would recognize. And this is a top issue for them. This is an increasingly becoming, it went from something that I think was completely under the radar in terms of the digital trade aspect, the trade language aspect, to something that is now really front and center. And so Daniel did a great job of unpacking how the non-discrimination language can be misinterpreted to immunize businesses from legitimate and common sense regulation. And as you mentioned, many tech firms other than GAFA and the people paid by them support legislative and regulatory efforts to rein in big tech's abuse of monopoly power. And we just have a situation where when big tech gatekeepers like Apple and Google and Meta and Amazon can acquire, protect, and extend their monopoly power without any consequences, maybe you have a handful of US companies that win, but effectively everyone else loses. And so to focus on one example of kind of a sector of digital markets, jurisdictions across the world have studied the mobile app ecosystem, and they have all effectively reached the same conclusion. Apple and Google have parallel monopolies over app distribution, and this allows them to impose unfair terms and conditions on developers, which in turn causes harm such as higher prices for consumers. And a few jurisdictions, as Daniel mentioned, have already enacted laws that prohibit conduct like this, while others, like Japan, for example, are hotly debating what the right answer is. Companies like Match.com, Epic Games, and Spotify, as well as smaller app developers and the small businesses that you mentioned that are members of the Responsible Online Commerce Coalition, who are just trying, really all of these businesses are just looking for a level playing field. In the case of the App Store issue, the app developers are just looking for relief from Apple and Google abusing their monopoly power to take a cut of up to 30% of in-app purchases. So we have the DMA in Europe and legislation enacted in Korea in 2021. Efforts like this represent progress, but the non-discrimination language that the US thankfully recently withdrew for the WTO e-commerce JSI, that would have posed a serious threat to similar efforts that other countries are actively considering to address these problems. And this includes popular bipartisan legislation in the US, like the open app markets, for example. And just to clarify, the non-discrimination language threatens to undermine not just current proposals that are being considered, but laws that have already been passed and enacted, like the DMA. And these jurisdictions are figuring out how to implement them effectively. So now that the big tech gatekeepers appear to be seeking an end run around anti-monopoly legislation, other tech businesses are taking note and paying close attention. And in a recent example, just last week, a diverse group of tech companies wrote a letter to President Biden and Ambassador Tai, thanking the administration for their recent actions to withdraw the digital non-discrimination language that would have, and I quote, risked serving the interests of several big tech monopolists to the detriment of everyone else, end quote. So hopefully that answers your question.
Absolutely. And super helpful. I think that the piece of that hopefully this panel helps put some sunshine on, but the work you're doing with the Amazon sellers and with the companies you advise is basically surfacing what is a very stealthy strategy to try and effectively internationally preempt what is a debate going on in lots of countries about how to deal with the downsides. There are upsides, but the downsides of what has become an extremely, the upsides of the digital marketplace are many, but the downside is the concentration. And how do we get the upsides of the digital market while dealing with the concentration? So I think a key feature of a bunch of these laws, and the thing that Daniel's presentation brings to the fore is, and Amanda, maybe you can explain this more, the thing that is in common, that in a way the stealthy provision, the twist on the provision that the US has been promoting would hit, is if you have a policy that targets based on size or dominance, which sort of inherently, I think you would have to make an effective competition policy. And you just mentioned, Amanda, the US equivalent of the Korean App Store bill, which many of these bills do what the DMA does, what they all do, which is they're not looking to get a startup in someone's basement. They're looking to get to the companies that have the market power to abuse everyone else. So maybe you can explain, given your expertise on competition law, why almost all of these initiatives around the world are focusing on rules, establishing rules for the largest tech platforms. And then that makes clearer how insidious, in a way, the twist is that Daniel just explained, because perhaps the very thing you need to be effective is the very thing that sneaky digital trade rule would make an illegal trade barrier.
Right. So I think it's critical. One of the things that you just mentioned is that it's not just about size. These regulations and legislative efforts and proposals are focused on the dominance and the gatekeeper power that these companies have. And, so although groups like the US Chamber of Commerce and other groups that are largely funded by the big tech companies, I think ITIF was one that was quoted earlier, although they claim that legislative efforts to restore competition to digital markets unfairly target US companies, that's not at all what is actually going on here. There have been countless jurisdictions, agencies, and other entities that have studied these markets and reached effectively the same conclusion. And so if you look at legislation like the DMA in Europe and the digital markets bill that's pretty far along now in the UK, they don't focus on these companies because of their size or because they are American. It's because there is overwhelming evidence that they have monopoly power and that they have repeatedly abused that monopoly power in ways that are harmful to consumers, to workers, to other market participants, businesses, like we discussed, who are just looking for a level playing field. And when you have a level playing field where everyone can compete on the merits of the goods and services that they're offering, that really is best. That's best for everyone. That's what's going to encourage innovation and let the cream rise to the top instead of these incumbent monopoly platforms using their market power to maintain their position. Let everybody compete. If they did great things in the beginning and were really innovative, and there's a reason why they were so successful to begin with. But let's they shouldn't be afraid to compete. Let's have these regulations and have these laws be able to be effective. And in fact, there's widespread bipartisan support for U.S. legislation that targets the exact same companies for the exact same conduct. But I really do want to thank Rethink Trade and Lori and Danielle for bringing this issue to light, because I do think that there was a situation where it seemed like maybe the big tech companies were kind of losing, taking on the antitrust regulation and regulatory efforts head on. And so they said, let me think, let's find like a backdoor way to get around this. And so they're claiming this, that they're being discriminated against because they're U.S. companies, but it's simply not the case.
Really helpful insights. And the companies now are in a total case of screaming hysteria fury because the U.S. government, the Biden administration, has responded to what are dozens of members of Congress who are sponsors of those bipartisan proposals that, Amanda, you've mentioned, and to smaller businesses and to unions and civil rights groups and consumer groups and everyone else who are all basically saying, President Biden, glad you're catching the US up on privacy protections, on tech anti-monopoly protections, but look over your shoulder because there is this backdoor attack. And it is coming to the US now, this fight, but it's been happening other places. And so I want to bring in Burju because she was involved in, she has had hands-on experience in sort of weathering Australia's process to pass the news media bargaining code. There's a US parallel to this. Canada has since passed one. And you basically, Burju, saw live how the interests representing the big tech companies use the trade framework to try and beat the stuffing out of Australia and threaten and kill this measure. And, as Daniel pointed out, thank goodness the old US e-commerce agreements, the US free trade agreements that had e-commerce chapters, the discrimination rules there had that bifurcated standard. They didn't have that lunatic rule that was in the USMCA that USTR pulled out of their proposal at WTO. But Burju, tell us a little bit from the front lines of seeing how exercise this.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Lori. But before I provide a background on the Australian News Media Bargaining Act. Like I like to thank Amanda, because I have to say, like, this week we heard a lot. Like, by the way, I'm in Geneva now. Greetings from Geneva. We heard a lot from the panelists here, like criticizing the US decision and saying that it's not about big tech. It's about small and medium, like, companies. So it is very, very, like, very important that you clarified it is actually about big tech. Thank you very much for your comments. And let's talk a little bit about the Australian News Media Bargaining Act. I think there is so much disinformation about the News Media Bargaining Act, and I think one of the reasons the tech companies and their allies claimed discrimination is because of that disinformation, and also they wanted to take advantage of the trade rules. So as we all know, small and medium-sized publishers play a very critical role in our democracy. They are small businesses that serve our communities, provide them with a voice, and shine a light in dark corners. Digital disruption and the resulting loss of advertising revenue has hurt small and medium publishers. And the last decade, we have seen lots of newsroom closures. Like, just to give you a figure, like in fact, like from January 2019 to August 2022, there were 265 newsroom closures across Australia. I mean, the situation in the US is very similar to Australia. If not, it's worse. So in light of these challenges, Australia took the bold step of addressing the bargaining power imbalance. This is the terminology they use. Like, there is a bargaining power imbalance between digital platforms and news media businesses. And they introduced the News Media Bargaining Code. The Australian government recognized that the platforms derive a benefit from the media content, and they had for years been getting access it for free. So they were free riding on the content. When the code was on the path of to becoming law, Google had made lots of threats. In fact, Facebook went further in Australia and blocked many pages well beyond news sites for several days. And this included like the state fire and health services during the wildfire season and at the height of pandemic. So like Australian public had very, very negative opinion of the platform. And Australian government considers the Facebook and Google's like threats and the actions as bullying. And the collective, so the act introduced the collective bargaining, and the collective bargaining efforts yielded results. Not only the big, but also small and independent media outlets made deals with Google. And Google recognized their value to their platform. And I was involved during my tenure at Mindoro Foundation with those in those efforts, like while small publishers were negotiating with Google, like bargaining with Google. So 24 small media publishers, they got a deal from Google, and they ended up hiring more staff, like providing more training for their like reporters, upgrading their digital infrastructure, improve their website. So they really benefited from the bill. And following the Australia's lead, this year Canada introduced the Online News Act, which is very similar to the News Media Bargaining Act. All of these policies address the monopoly problem that also has led the Biden administration to launch a priority all of government competition initiative, as Amanda mentioned. And in the case of News Media Bargaining Code and the Canadian Online News Act, the monopolies in question are the few dominant like online platforms that control digital advertising and content distribution. And which platforms are required to bargain with the content creators is determined on the basis of size and the market power. without regard to national origin. Australians didn't really pick like, oh, Google and Facebook. And actually now like there was a review of the Australian news media bargaining code this year, and the Treasury started the process, and there was lots of demand from the Australian publishers that the Australian Competition Authority, ACCC, should also designate apart from Google and Facebook, TikTok, because most of the new generation like Gen Z get their news from TikTok. So it's not discriminatory. It's not that they pick like American platforms, and they picked Google and Facebook because of their size and market dominance, not because they were American. But despite this, some of the technology companies have attacked the Australian law, and first Australian law and then the Canadian law, claiming that it violates the trade Australia's and Canada's trade obligations, and with respect to the United States, like Australian FDA and USMCA. So in both cases, like Australian government and also the Canadian government said like, no, that's not the intention of the bill. It is the gatekeepers, the dominant platforms are American. And that's why like the bill applies to them. So very clearly, like I can say that the Australian media bargaining code is compatible with Australia's trade commitment, and all this like outrage that tech companies created around like Australian's news media bargaining law code and non-discrimination is baseless.
In echo. Daniel did a very helpful report with some of our colleagues here where he went through the National Trade Estimates listings and pulled out things like companies' attacks on the Australian Media Bargaining Act, on the Canadian version, on the Korean bill. So you can actually see the kind of arguments that are being made, which if they got their way and got these kind of new non-discrimination rules that made facially neutral laws illegal trade barriers, they would have a much stronger case to actually attack. So just to make clear, this is not hyperbolic. It is like they put it in writing, they spelled it out. And that's an important point because there's been sort of an arc of this issue. And I want to flag, first of all, that report is called Digital Trade Doublespeak, the attempt to hijack trade lingo. You can find it on our website, which is rethinktrade.org. At rethinktrade.org, Digital Trade's page, there's all kinds of really excellent research that outlines the different arguments, that unpacks them, takes apart what the attacks have been versus what the reality is, lays out actual words from these interests so you can see what the strategy was, and lots of letters of support and demand to do what USTR did, and then letters of thanks from members of Congress, from businesses, from other entities, thanking them for protecting the policy space to regulate the tech platforms. So all of this has now sort of come to a head in the US late. And I'm wondering, Burcu, you were one of the first people, I think, who realized this attack. So I remember during the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations early on, which we were both involved in, you were very focused on this digital trade chapter. You were very focused on this idea of tech firms, where you were one of the first people, frankly, who realized what this sneak attack was going to be. And I'm wondering if you can just give us a little summary as we sort of close our panel. I want to leave a few minutes for questions, but give us a summary of the issue, how it's evolved, and what you think is going to be next as far as the JSI situation, etc.
Sure. Yeah, I would be happy to do that. Yeah, you and you are right, Lori. This during the TPP negotiations, we were following the TPP negotiations very closely. There was this buzz about the e-commerce chapter, and I have to say this was like 2013. So at that time, the chapter was called e-commerce chapter. And I'll tell you the reason why it is digital trade now. But just to give you a background information, so there was this buzz about the e-commerce chapter of the TPP, but the chapter was never considered a controversial chapter. It was never leaked, so we didn't really know what was going on. And then when they concluded the negotiations well before like the final year. I mean, there were a few controversial issues, so the negotiators were not coming to the round. So it was very, very hard for us to know what was going on. But then in the meantime, there was another free trade agreement, which was called Trading Services Agreement. It was a WTO plurilateral agreement that was leaked, and then we could see the e-commerce chapter and what was in the TPP. Anyway, so the TPP concluded in 2015, but my guess is these provisions were first introduced in 2013. And now think about that, 2013. And think about the technology we have in 2013. Just to confirm that, this week, I've been hearing from the negotiators, they were saying that, technology has evolved a lot. But the problem is the rules that we are trying to address, the rules that we use to address this technology hasn't been developed. They haven't been upgraded. They are still the same. So we are trying to address the today's and tomorrow's challenges, like technological challenges, with the rules which were made in 2013. So because the TPP inspired many other free trade agreements, including the USMCA, WTO, GSI, proposals. When you look at the proposals coming from different parties, you can all see the TPP, they all mimic the TPP because they sign on to TPP. It became a blueprint. But the issue is, as I said, the technology evolved, the rules not. And I think, when the United States Trade Representative announced that they were withdrawing some of the most controversial provisions, including the non-discrimination, but also data flows and provision on data flows, like the local server requirements and the trade secret protections for source code and algorithms, it became clear that the administration is aware that these rules are outdated, and they are trying to synchronize the tech and trade policies, because the timing of the announcement was very timely. It just came before the executive order on AI. So it was very clear that the administration, and particularly the USTR, was approaching the digital trade, because now it's called digital trade. In USMCA, they invented this new terminology, which is digital trade, because e-commerce sounded so 1990, and so they're approaching trade policy, digital trade policy, in a very, very diligent way. And today I was on another panel, and I told them, then look, Catherine Tai is a member of the Interagency Committee on Competition. You can't expect her to join the meetings of that competition committee and then put these rules in U.S. trade agreements, because she would realize how these rules were protecting the monopolies, protecting the monopolies of few platforms. So I think we are in a very, very a very crucial moment, and I can see the effects of that decision here today. I was at a panel. I was at a meeting about data localization, and it was a very nuanced meeting. I think everyone took that step back, and now we are I think everyone took a step back, and now we are having meaningful discussions, nuanced discussions about these provisions, and trade negotiators are recognizing the technology has evolved, and we need new rules, new exceptions, and new way of thinking about digital trade rules.
I think everybody is able to unmute themselves of our participants of our audience. If you have a question, please do unmute yourself and ask if you have a question. Otherwise, I have a question. So I'm going to give a chance here for folks to try to ask a question.
There's a question on the chat box on the right. Do you want me to read it?
Please.
Christine Bannon asks, what is the best way that trade agreements can still make sure that there is no actual discrimination based on national treatment while preventing the preemption of national regulations that regulate monopolistic companies? Do you want to take that?
I can do it, or you can. Go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, I think that there's an, and I will say that the easy answer is that for de facto claims, so the claims in which you're not targeting regulation that discriminates on its face, the complaining country has to demonstrate that protectionism is the primary motivation of the regulation or of the policy. If you can prove that, then it's okay. It's a discriminatory trade measure and it's legitimate to criticize it. But if not, then it should stand. And I think that that's the best way, and that's where the trade negotiators should go.
And I would just build on that by saying, if you look at the language that, for instance, was in the US-Korea agreement, that has, as Daniel described, the bifurcated standard, that now needs to be clarified because of the jurisprudence that Daniel has laid out about the role of intent. So with a few words added, the structure should be, you intentionally actually de facto discriminate, that's a trade barrier. You don't, and it's facially neutral, then you have to prove intent, but we need to clarify that the language needs to say something that makes clear the burden of proof is on the country that is challenging it, not on the defending country, and that the predominant intent, that language needs to be added, has to be proved, because now with the jurisprudence that's been established, it's not so clear, that old structure, as it would have otherwise been. So the Korea agreement is 80% of the way there, that language, and then it just needs some clarifying, and that would actually do the job. And just to close, because I know they're going to shut us down in 1 minute, with all of these issues right now, of course, the debate continues in the US with respect to what the new rules should be. But I want to just thank the panelists and the members of Congress and the unions and everyone in the US who helped to air these issues, because I think for once, the US is actually having a very helpful role in the digital trade debate as compared to pushing the bad thing, which has been its role for some number of years. And so kudos to the Biden administration, to USTR TIE, to the USTR delegation at Geneva. And there's a lot of work still to be done to figure out what the next US position will be. But thanks to the work of folks on this panel, part of that debate will be the non-discrimination of digital products issue. Stay tuned for Daniel's paper. We will have that up at Rethink Trade, rethinktrade.org. It will be a more detailed analysis of the information we were able to preview with you today. And I want to thank again the panel and everyone who joined us as a participant, and wish everyone a good evening in Geneva and a good day in DC. And in 30 seconds, we're going to get kicked out of this platform. So goodbye, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much.